Okay. This works. Okay. The last people finished getting their coffees. Very good. Okay. Well, I think it's amazing to see all of you in here. There is a sense of happiness in this room, which probably partially has to do with what's going to start, but I think partially also with the fact that you had your year exams this week and last week, so you're basically done with your study year, and this is sort of the last moment before actually having a longer break, and I think you should enjoy it as much as possible. Before we talk about tonight and the coming week, I just wanted to make an announcement. Those of you who are in the second year, you're going to do your P5 project next year. And there will be a number of projects where actually you can travel abroad. I'm just kind of flagging this up. So if you make up your travel plans for the next semester, there will also be options actually to go abroad. You'll get a separate email on that. I just wanted to announce it because I heard if you say something several times, it sticks more in people's minds. But that was just the household thing. Now let's actually switch to the winter school. I have to say, we, especially for you guys, made sure the weather is a bit cooler, so it resembles a winter school today. So yeah, that you kind of sense a bit how it would be. We also made it a bit darker, so everything is kind of prepared for a winter school to start. But I'm kind of joking about this. At the same time, I have to say, you know, I hope that this is not the winter days we're going to see in the future. And this is where I'm kind of straight on into what our winter school is about. But that's not what I'm going to tell you. I have the pleasure to introduce you to, well, the guy that has been thinking a lot about what the winter school that we actually had planned for the winter now became a summer school is about. His name is Selçuk Balamir. There he is. A warm welcome, please, and an applause. And what's really nice is, and I'm kind of, I have a CV here from the Royal Academy of Arts, where they say that you're an online visiting artist. We're very happy that you're not online, but an in-person visiting artist. Selçuk, and this is the description here, is a designer, researcher, organizer, working at the intersections of creative production, radical politics, and ecological transition. I'll leave it there. The rest of the introduction he will do. He's not alone here. There's a whole team of sort of co-tutors, let's say, but he will also introduce them. And now I'm basically done. I'm sure you're kind of now really interested in what this is all about. Selçuk, I think that's the place for you to take over. So here, you know, here.
All right.
I'm gone.
Thank you, Marcus. Testing. Ooh. I think I'll have to play with this a little bit. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Well, thank you, Marcus, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank Madeleine, Henri, Esther, Rose, and Marike and Marjolein, who helped us when this was a winter school still, and now that it's a summer school. So we struggled a lot with COVID uncertainties, and it's finally happening. I'm also very grateful to René, who's taking my picture there. Thank you for suggesting me for the AIR program. And to all the 45 trainers, advisors, and respondents that accepted to participate. This is really a collaborative effort, and you will all be collaborating. I also would like to acknowledge two people who cannot be here today. One is my mom, who is an architect, and it's her birthday today. So I'm gifting this talk to her. And the other is my dad, who is an urbanist. Surprise, surprise. And unfortunately, he's been fighting COVID for the last month. So I really hope he will recover and will get to see this recording as well. So here's what we expect today. I'll briefly introduce myself, then give the general theme of our winter school, summer school, whatever you call it. There are no more seasons. Some theoretical foundations to ground it, and finally the practical flow and goals of our time together. And I've divided the talk in 3 parts, so you don't get to sleep. We'll have some moments to chat in between the sections. So I am a designer by training, an educator by profession, and an activist by inclination. For most of the last decades, I've been researching post-capitalist design, practicing spatial commoning, and organizing for climate justice. Actually, it all started when I was graduating from my design studies. I didn't know how to practice design outside market relations, outside capitalism. So I retreated to academia, did a PhD in cultural analysis to research exactly these questions. To what extent can design be disentangled from capital? How do we prefigure a resilient and regenerative economy? And is there a post-capitalist blueprint for the rapid and just eco-social transition in front of us? Since my research was meant to be an academic work and no crystal ball reading, I focused on the most mundane and practical kinds of product design practices: tools, machines, means of production. I studied modular kits, DIY machines, construction systems. A few examples stood out: open structures, WikiHouse, OpenDesk, and precious plastic. You see some of the examples here. The common thread between these practices is that they all rely on commoning. Commoning can mean a few things. It can mean doing or making in common. It can mean producing or practicing commons, or being or becoming a commoner. So I identified these 3 instances of commoning in design labor, in design knowledge, and design artifacts, which I named peer designing, open blueprints, and maker machines. And this triad stood in direct opposition to the commodification of design. Even though these projects are remarkable experiments in the here and now, prefiguration alone is not enough. Projects that are the most influential and the most successful in my research were the ones that combined these exemplary prefigurative practices with equally impressive speculative discourses. They dared to blend the messy, imperfect experiments in the present with bold, visionary propositions. So neither simple DIY hobbies nor pure design fiction. It's that combination that makes me call these emergent practices post-capitalist. I ended up calling my research Unsustaining the Commodity Machine, because I wanted to counter this erosion of the term sustainability, which basically nowadays means keeping things exactly the way they are with the smallest tweaks possible. Also, because I wanted to emphasize that it's not that myopic attention to commodities themselves that matters, but disrupting, interrupting, unsustaining the reproduction of commodification, of commodified social and productive relations. Don't worry, this was the theoretical academic part. I'm not much of an academic, that's where it ends. Which leads me to my spatial commoning practice, because frankly, I was restless. I could not research these things and not practice them next to it. So in my research, the scale was objects, In my practice, it's the spaces of living that became the primary scale of intervention. It all started with Nieuwland in Amsterdam Oost. Some 7 years ago, we acquired and renovated this old primary school building to co-design, self-produce, and self-manage our spaces of living, working, and socializing. I still live in Nieuwland and experience luxury communism on a daily basis. But commoning works by paying it forward. So I wanted to carry these learnings into the next iteration. So 4 years ago, we applied to a tender by the municipality to build from scratch a new commune, this time 5 times larger. And yes, we used Cité d'Habitation in our propaganda material. We agreed on 4 foundational principles for our project: commoning, care, sustainability, diversity, and we called it the Nieuwe Meent, the new commons. The Nieuwe Meent will be a 7-story wooden construction with 40 units of social housing and living groups, each of them with custom floor plans. The project has a budget of 7 million euros, which is paid by a combination of a credit union, public finance, and crowdfunding. So if everything goes right, the construction will start later this summer, and we hope to move in next year. Here are some renders that makes me feel like a post-capitalist real estate agent, but you see what it feels like. So I've shown you post-capitalist design examples, and I've shown you spatial commoning practices. But these solutions and alternatives will be quite irrelevant if we fail to bring about an epochal, civilizational breaking point in this decade zero, which could eventually, maybe, give us that narrow window of opportunities to prevent a complete climate breakdown and mass extinction. This is why climate justice was at the center of my practice for more than a decade. And the climate justice movement took me to the ends of the world and back. It made me put my body on the line, on the way of the machines, over land and sea. I learned that disobedience is not just the greatest form of body art and land art, but it is the engine of social progress in history. These aren't shots from movies, by the way. These are actual actions that I and some of my comrades took part in. Turns out, being a social movement organizer and putting creativity in the service of strategy is the ultimate form of post-capitalist design. It's not doing art about ecology or creating awareness about social issues or movements. I'm really talking about developing campaigns, growing collectives, and organizing actions, which is humbling, inspiring, and validating work. Sometimes even a simple banner blends arts and politics, and it is simultaneously a conceptual, relational, and performative practice. And I'm here to share one particular story, one particular project. In May 2019, at the Circus Theater in Scheveningen, the shareholders of Royal Dutch Shell were having their annual general meeting, just as they have been for the last 20 years. At that time, I was part of Code Rood, a grassroots disobedient climate action collective, readying our brand new campaign. Our spokesperson was attending the meeting for an intervention. When it was her turn at the microphone, she declared that the people present there were witnessing a historic day, that it would be the last Shell shareholder meeting ever to be held. She went on to explain to the perplexed looks of the executive board that in the midst of a climate emergency, the last thing we needed was exactly what was happening there. Continuing business as usual, maximizing shareholder value with short-term profits. So we just wanted to make sure that would never happen ever again. So this was the launch of the Shell Must Fall campaign, and we thought it would be quite decent to inform the executive board first. At that moment, little did we know that a year later, her prediction would turn out to be true. Sadly enough, though, it wasn't our action that cancelled the meeting. We were just 100 days away from what was labeled already the most highly anticipated action of the year when the pandemic cancelled any such gathering. Then last year, the company decided to move its headquarters to London. They cited some vague reasons like streamlining operations, but even Financial Times, which is hardly a radical publication, remarked that it was partly the mounting activist pressure from climate campaigners like us that caused this capital flight. And while we cannot claim this to be a complete victory, rest assured that our comrades in UK have already caused massive disruption to the company's first ever shareholder meeting in London earlier this year, shouting the same slogans as we were planning to. So, maybe you are wondering, why am I talking to you, spatial designers, here for the kickoff of your summer school, talking to you about the company formerly known as Royal Dutch Shell. What I would actually like to talk to you and work with you on is designing a rapid and just and comprehensive eco-social transition. But unfortunately, we have some concrete obstacles like Shell on front of that. Dislodging these obstacles is a precondition for a just transition. So let's talk about Shell. I believe there is merit in focusing on a concrete case study like Shell instead of talking about an energy transition on the abstract. Now, the entanglement of overdeveloped societies with carbon pollution is a complex matter. But there is absolutely no doubt about the paramount responsibility and culpability of a handful of companies in the energy industry. They have dominated the sector and profited from fossil fuels and their derivatives. They have built corporate empires with geopolitical, infrastructural, financial, and ideological underpinnings. And these companies knew about the consequences of their actions all my life, and they doubled down on this path. They have manufactured dangerous distractions like greenwashing, carbon footprints, carbon offsetting to divert attention and to deny their role. So I was one of the 17,000 co-plaintiffs alongside Milieu Defensie and other organizations who sued Royal Dutch Shell. And last year, we won the case. The court in The Hague agreed that the human rights consequences of climate breakdown are more important than the company's rights to operate freely and profit from fossil fuels. Now, the company is being held responsible for the emissions of its customers, and it has to halve its total emissions within this decade. This is unprecedented, but this is also just the beginning. There is no viable business model for Shell. Its current legal and financial form is inadequate for implementing the necessary changes. As long as it remains a public limited company, it cannot keep fossil fuels in the ground. It cannot decommission its own infrastructure. It cannot provide a fair deal for its ex-workers, nor compensate damaged communities, nor repair ecosystems. In short, it cannot put itself out of business. If it cannot be nudged in the right direction to make voluntary incremental adjustments, then deep structural changes can only be enforced upon Shell. So the only option left is to radically but responsibly restructure its ownership, control, and purpose by any legal, economic, and political means necessary. Call it dismantling, decommissioning, sunsetting, phasing out, retiring, I don't mind. It is necessary, overdue, and inevitable. So let's talk about Shell. Consider it the perfect case study that encapsulates broader issues of Western extractivism, Dutch colonialism, financial speculation, and corporate control. Shell might be moving on from its Dutch past, but let's remember how it is still benefiting from social acceptance and national pride in this country. By extension, let's talk about our role, our complicity and responsibility as designers in this land. And let's talk about what we can do. Speaking of the complicity of designers, I'd like to introduce you to a very special architect, Will. Will is an architectural designer at Bowman Riley. And Will has designed and built an electric car charging station for Shell. The Shell website says, and I quote, that Will is hugely excited about the idea of working with Shell to create the EV hub of the future. So I thought, let's meet Will.
I guess I've always been quite creative. Once my uncle asked me to build a birdhouse for him. I built this extremely elaborate and over-engineered bird box. My artistic license kind of got the better of me. I'm currently working on developing a design for an EV charge hub where electric vehicles can go and charge up their batteries. This is the first time that a full Shell petrol station has been transformed into a full EV charge centre. As a keen cyclist, it's a real positive thing to work on a project that promotes more electric cars on the road. What the birdhouse journey taught me was keep designing, keep innovating, because architecture is just all about problem solving.
Thanks to the innovation of people like Will, Shell's first electric-only station in the UK is taking shape.
So thanks to the innovation of people like Will, Shell is able to greenwash and design wash its image. Make no mistake, Shell spends more money on marketing than on renewables. And we are talking about a few percentage points of its total investments. Will probably gets his over-engineered birdhouse charging station paid from the marketing budget. To summarize, Will designed a charging station for Shell. That's greenwashing. Then Will played in an advertisement for Shell. That's also greenwashing. Don't be Will. But I want to be totally honest with you. Perhaps some of you recognize a little bit of Will in themselves. And I'm not here to mock or dismiss you. I actually want to invite Will into the conversation. So, would you please pair up with your neighbor? Now, here, yes. I'd like one of you to role play Will, and the other one to hold a frank conversation with Will. You can talk about climate breakdown, Royal Dutch Shell, electric cars, or architecture. I mean, he seems like a good chap to talk, right? But please don't lecture each other, and try to hear each other out. So, would you do that for 5 minutes for me? And then we'll harvest a few of your reactions. If you thought this part was a crazy radical speech, just wait for the next one where we go deeper into the analysis. So here we go. So decades and decades of great transformation are ahead of us, right? And there's a big role for designers like you to repurpose inadequate buildings, reclaiming defunct industries, and regenerating damaged territories. And yet, this is not just a matter of technical expertise. It also requires navigating complex ethical considerations. What kind of energy transition are we going for? Do we wish Shell to become a green capitalist renewable monopoly? Think about Will. Or do we want to turn it into a decommodified cooperative energy democracy? There is a slogan by climate justice organizer Quinton Sankofa from the US. Transition is inevitable. Justice is not. Let's get to work. What does that mean? What do we mean when we say just transition? Isn't everything we do to reduce carbon emissions inherently a good thing? A solar charging station over there, blah, blah, blah. Shouldn't we just indiscriminately use every tool at our disposal to stop global heating? My answer is yes and no. That there might be a right time for some things, and there are other things that will inevitably make things worse. If, for instance, overdeveloped countries like ours had started with individual action, consumer choice, and market-based solutions 50 years ago, maybe it would have delivered some version of green capitalism, perhaps delaying crossing the biophysical limits of this planet by a century. Perhaps a point will be reached where tweaking the geochemical composition of the planet will be desperately needed to lessen some of the worst impacts. It all depends who does it, why do they do it, and when. So perhaps on a volatile world, solutions might be dynamic and contextual. So it's not easy answers here. Still, some things are certain. The time for incremental measures within the coordinates of capitalism is over. You mentioned we are at the beginning of the revolution. At this late hour, nothing short of system change is going to work. We have centuries of decolonial and anti-capitalist critique, decades and decades of scientific evidence, and an incontestable intergenerational duty to ground this. Claiming otherwise have multiple flavors. Market fundamentalism, climate delayism, growth fanaticism, eco-modernism, eco-fascism. I'm afraid these are at best desperate coping mechanisms and at worst anti-humanist and anti-naturalist death drives. if you want a numerical approximation of what I mean by system change, consider this. Radical reductions imply halving emissions every decade until mid-century, and then keeping that balance carbon negative at least until the end of the century. This means that the biggest, most impactful chunk of decarbonization has to happen first. So there is no such thing as starting modestly and increasing ambitions, the small steps approach that we mentioned. In this decade zero, even the latest IPCC reports recognize the need to give up economic growth if we want to tackle any of these. This is where we are, because we delayed all these decades. Here is another numerical approximation for system change. Carbon pollution per capita is so grossly unequal, with 10% of world population responsible for half the emissions and half of world's population responsible for 10% of emissions. That abolishing carbon privileges of a few, here we also see that the richest 1% actually consumes as much as the poorest 50%. This is newer numbers. So abolishing these carbon privileges of that 1% is the fastest, least disruptive, and most effective way to get started. So don't ask me to stop taking showers. Don't ask me to, eat less meat and drive less cars. There is the problem. Unless they are going to get out of the way, we are not supposed to be acting upon it. So in that sense, justice is not an add-on to the laundry list of an already complex and exhaustive set of techno-scientifically determined transformations that need to happen. It's a moral compass. It's a field guide. And frankly, the only politically viable program that doesn't involve perpetuating and aggravating already entrenched mass suffering. So intersecting issues, struggles, and solutions is how you build power, resilience, and diversity on this unjust, damaged, but not yet broken planet. In other words, there are no quick fixes and no silver bullet solutions. But the patient, careful, intricate work of weaving environmental, economic, political, and racial justice into a tapestry of social progress. While it's impossible to capture the complexity of it all, here are two slogans that at least hint at that ethos of the just transition. Return, repair, regenerate impacted lands and ecosystems. Decarbonize, decommodify, democratize, decolonize energy and power. So try to keep in mind these principles in the coming days. Now, I'd like to give Shell another layer of meaning. And doing so, I'd like to introduce some design political concepts that will structure our work. The Industrial Workers of the World is an international, revolutionary, industrial labor union founded in Chicago in 1905. The preamble of their constitution ends with the following statement. It is the historic mission of the working class to do away with capitalism. The army of production must be organized, not only for everyday struggle with capitalists, but also to carry on production when capitalism shall have been overthrown. By organizing industrially, we are forming the structure of a new society within the shell of the old. Within the shell of the old. Such a vividly architectural metaphor to preserve the structural elements to build something new. Call it adaptive reuse, but apply it to an entire economic and civilizational model. Note, however, that their strategic focus has been on organizing within industrial production, with the expectation that once capitalism is over, its industrial legacy would be just inherited so that it would be carried on. Today, this position is simply indefensible. The colonial, capitalist, and industrial paradigms are so intertwined, so indistinguishable, that perhaps extractivism is the closest term that I use to capture the logic of that continuity. While we are at it, I'd like to complement and contrast this with another iconic revolutionary statement. Buenaventura Durruti was a Spanish anarcho-syndicalist Civil War hero. When asked whether victory was worth it if the country will be in ruins, he's attributed the following answer. You must not forget that we can also build. It is we who build these palaces and cities, we, the workers. We can build others to take their place, and better ones. We are not in the least afraid of ruins. We are going to inherit the earth. There is not the slightest doubt about that. The bourgeoisie might blast and ruin its own world before it leaves the stage of history. We carry a new world here in our hearts. That world is growing in this minute. You might be wondering, why am I giving you these dramatic quotes from a long bygone revolutionary era, especially considering that they seemingly failed big time? Shouldn't we be afraid of a world in ruins when it's not just the built environment, but the very fabric of life that is disintegrating in front of our eyes? Is there any merit left in Durruti's confident optimism that the workers shall build better palaces and cities for themselves out of the capitalist ruins? If I grossly simplify, the preamble and Durruti represent two alternatives, two opposing positions. One is, we are going to inherit the productive infrastructure intact, and the other is saying, we are going to start from scratch, no matter what is left. I'd like to invite you to explore the options in between, because I don't think we can afford either scenarios at this stage. What I still admire about both statements is the strong utopian speculative impulse they have. I believe that near-term, plausible, hopeful, speculative fiction can be indistinguishable from strategic policy recommendations. Perhaps storytelling and a little bit of propaganda can set the transition in motion. So I encourage you to embrace your most speculative designer selves in the summer school. And I challenge you to prove Frederick Jameson wrong and to make the end of capitalism easier to imagine than the end of the world. The good news is that the expression from the shell of the old means something radically different for later generations. Quite the opposite, actually. Since the 60s, The expression has been repurposed by feminist, ecologist, and pacifist strands of the New Left to signify what has become known as prefigurative politics. To prefigure means to anticipate or enact the preferable future in the present as though it has already been achieved. To shape things in the present the way we'd like them to be in the future. Such an affinity with design, no? So the emphasis has been increasingly more on already forming the new society, already growing the new world without waiting or postponing endlessly a revolutionary moment or the downfall of capitalism. By means of carving out spaces that foreshadow and precipitate that new society, hollowing out the spaces of the old world. Let's call this new world a new society, for lack of a better word, post-capitalism. Post-capitalism is neither a historical inevitability nor an ever-present alternative. It is rather that narrow emergency pathway to avoid civilizational collapse and mass extinction. Given the circumstances, we don't even have the luxury to have a fully coherent, positive utopian project. Post-capitalism is rather the riddle of history unresolved. It is what we fill the void of that shell. It is what flourishes from capitalist ruins. And the task of post-capitalist designers is to give shape, meaning, and purpose to those. Perhaps you are familiar with Paul Mason, who is a polemical figure on the left, but he published this book called Post-Capitalism in 2017. And here comes a quote of interest for designers, where he says, "We have to design the transition to post-capitalism, because most theorists of post-capitalism either just declared it to exist or predicted it as an inevitability. Few considered the problems of transition." So one of the first tasks is to outline and test a range of models showing how such a transitional economy might work. So neither simply desiring or observing post-capitalism, designing the transition to post-capitalism is done by outlining and testing a range of models. In other words, combining speculation and prefiguration. If design can be both prefigurative and speculative, then post-capitalism can indeed be designed and the means and the ends of the transition reconciled. So I want to ask you, and this summer is a provocation and an invitation to you, spatial designers. Are you ready for this gigantic challenge? Do you have what it takes to be a designer of the just transition? Can you speculate and prefigure post-capitalist futures? Can you put your skills, your privileges into the service of the most impacted? How will you bring them care, repair, and justice? But before I continue to the choreography of the summer school and the assignments, I'd like to get back to your conversation with Will. Maybe you would like to switch roles this time. Could you convert or at least provoke Will enough about just transition, about designing post-capitalism? And yeah, what would emerge from these conversations? You have 5 more minutes for these, so please pursue your conversations. to recap some of the points and to express... Will is back, I guess. Never mind. We'll talk with the drinks with Will. So if it is not clear yet for you, it's that we will take the comprehensive decommissioning of Shell as a non-negotiable, inevitable starting point. We will work on Shell as this Dutch-specific case study for composting capitalism and for taking responsibility for colonial and ecological reparations. This involves unlearning predominant sustainability paradigms and daring to imagine hopeful futures emerging from the ruins of carbon majors. The outcome, hopefully, will be nothing less than a collaborative roadmap for this evolution planet of your school. But concretely, we'll be doing 3 things together. And I will just run through the practicalities so that it is crystal clear and we can collect questions about it. First, ahead of us, there's a training weekend. Then we have 4 assignment days, and then we have a final performance. Let's go through them. Your summer school starts tomorrow with a 2-day crash course, intensive training. Key concepts and principles of climate justice will be introduced as an ethical compass for the eco-social transition ahead. It will be hosted by 9 amazing women, all experienced movement leaders and facilitators. Some of us are actually among us here tonight. Would you please rise so that we say hi to you? Or wave, that's also good enough. Thank you. They will introduce themselves and their workshops tomorrow. You will simulate grassroots organizing techniques and social movement tools. So expect some weird hand signals, some teach-ins, energizer games, but don't worry, we won't be wearing overalls. Instead, you will be engaging in political debates about climate breakdown, ecological transition, and social justice. You will navigate ethical complexity to develop your own position and to get to know your team members. Because during the entire summer school, you will work as affinity groups. Here's a term and a tool coming from social movements. You will be in randomly assigned teams that blend first and second year students and architecture, urbanism, and landscape tracks. In case you are wondering, the groups are named after species declared extinct last year. Don't worry, you will get a QR code at the end. No need to take a photo now. You will find your way. I will explain it all. These screenshots are actually from our Notion page. You can find all the information about where, when, who, what, how, everything will be there. You can reach it through a tab on your general Teams channel, but also there is a QR code both at the end of this presentation and downstairs. So you will be in teams. Clusters of 5 teams will cycle through 4 workshops over 2 days. So you'll get all the same content, but in different orders. We will be together for 2 days from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and we will share lunch and we will share our whole day. You don't need to bring computers, but you may want to take notes on paper, tablet, or phone. After the Sunday break, the second part of the summer school consists of 4 evening sessions of 3 hours each. Your team will collaborate on a spatial design project with an explicit climate justice agenda. We will be basically staging this experiment, this encounter between 2 worlds, between climate justice and spatial design, with the hope to build bridges that can take us through the just transition. Can you already make a wild guess on what we will be working on concretely? Each team is assigned a piece of this vertically integrated death machine that we call Royal Dutch Shell. Offices, extraction fields, rigs, petrochemical refineries, pipelines, gas stations. Your goal will be to imagine and design a rapid, responsible, and justice-based scenario for decommissioning and repurposing each infrastructure site. Now, this will be done in phases. On each assignment day, you will fast forward 10 years so that you capture different stages of the just transition over the next decades. The first day, Monday, is to familiarize yourself with the existing state of your sites. On the second day, you speculate how the status quo gets irreversibly broken. And overall, instead of proposing a singular designerly gesture frozen in time, you're invited to engage in cathedral thinking over many, many decades. Again, all these info are on Notion, so don't panic if you don't read them now. During these work sessions, you will be supported by advisors. Some of them are among us. Can you please wave as well? But we have many more. You too. Advisors, of course, yeah. We have graduates of the school that are also joining us, advisors. Probably they will understand you better than all of us. So all the advisors are professional researchers, educators in design and in sustainability fields. They might provoke you with by questioning your assumptions. They might suggest new perspectives or maybe mediate challenges in your team. Every day, there will be a dozen of advisors available, but you only have 2 consultations each time. So time is precious. Not everybody has to talk to all the advisors all the time, so choose wisely. We will allocate some of them to you. They will pick some groups themselves. And basically, you're expected to self-organize your work as a team. But it's advisable to distribute some roles in your team. For instance, have 1 or 2 research leads that will do the most of the background info research, fact-checking, you name it. Have at least somebody who is confident about their visual graphical design skills to lead on sketches, models, and the slides that we will produce. And already pick a storytelling lead that will develop the texts and will be delivering the final. You will all have dedicated workspaces in Marineterrein, and advisors will be visiting you there, so you don't get to move around. You should bring your tablets and laptops, and you do get a budget for sketching and modeling materials. You will also use a Miro board to collect your research and documentation so that advisors can keep track of your progress, even if we don't get to see your team in person. Considering the kind of daunting scale of the task and the limited time we have together, you may be wondering how all this will come together. You will follow a common template so that it all adds up to a coherent whole. We are all part of the puzzle. At the end of every evening, you are asked to upload 2 things on Teams. One is a single square image that captures the state of affairs in that decade, and a single caption of narration that tells that story of that decade. You look really scared. Don't worry. It's going to be all right. You will be 6 people. You'll have plenty of time to come up with these 2 things. But indeed, each session is some sort of a self-contained pressure cooker, right? But this way, advisors will be able to quickly catch up with your progress of the previous days. On the third day, they will just come. So show me your first 2 pictures and captions, and bam, we are already knowing what you are talking about. And don't worry, there will be also extra time to revise and harmonize everything on Friday morning. Then, Friday afternoon, we meet in a piece of Shell infrastructure that is already repurposed. The former Shell lab canteen built by Arthur Stahl in 1977. When we all come together in Tollhouse Town, we will be time traveling to 2050 for a Just Transition Congress to take stock of what has been done and what is left to do. Imagine a little bit like Siam, but with less white male egos. So your final presentations will be a performance. You will be role-playing yourself in your 40s and telling your case study, the story of your case study. And this will be a Pecha style presentation where one spokesperson from each team will have only 5 minutes to go through the 4 pairs of image and caption. Afterwards, we have 4 respondents that will reflect on the collective work and will hold a collective closing discussion with you. And once the Congress is over, we will have festive drinks and a dinner back in Marineterrein before the Midsummer Night Lecture and the end of the year party. Perhaps we will be chanting the activist song from the 90s, dancing on the ruins of multinational corporations. Finally, to end it all right on time, we will compile and immortalize your work in a printed publication. You see just some dummies here. We want this to be a massive wall calendar spanning 4 decades of the Just Transition. You will all get a copy as a daily reminder of the task of our generation. And I will personally make sure that both Mark Rutte and Ben van Beurden receives a copy themselves. To conclude, I want to leave you with a tentative outline for the narrative arc that we are going to build. I'm saying tentative because you will be shaping that in the coming days and in the coming decades. So nothing here is fixed. It will be reshaped through your inputs. But imagine, it's 2050. The decades of the great transformation have been chaotic, complex, and confusing. Still, a lot has been achieved. The European Union has socialized its entire energy sector and created millions of jobs, green jobs across the world. The cornerstone of the transition in the Netherlands has been the swift decommissioning and repurposing of the legacy infrastructure and assets and impacts of Royal Dutch Shell following its bankruptcy declaration and subsequent public takeover in 2025. To mark the 25th anniversary of that watershed event, the Ministry of Just Transition has commissioned an extensive synthesis report recapitulating all activities relating to the phasing out of the carbon major. All spatial designers involved in the process are asked to submit a summary of their achievements and challenges. I'll leave you with this. I have some still practical points to end on, but let's collect some questions to clarify the logistics, the assignments. And if you missed any of this presentation because you fainted, that's okay. Everything is going to be written on Notion, and the recording of this talk and the transcript will be also available. So, are you ready to make Shell history? And what questions do you have?